Hello again, and thank you for joining us for the third session of our symposium. We are going to start the third session, Remapping Modernism, with our speakers, Rodrigo Moura, Nicole Smythe-Johnson, and Julia Bryan-Wilson, with closing remarks by Chen Callier. This third session will be moderated and introduced by Angela Miller. Angela Miller is a professor of art and history and archaeology at Washington University in St. Louis. Her essay, The People Looks Upon Its Own Life, Self-Taught Art Between the Wars, is included in Boundary Trouble, The Self-Taught Artist and American Avant-Gardes, a publication edited by Lynn Cook in relation to the exhibition Outliers and American Vanguard Art, organized at the National Gallery of Art in 2018. So now it's my great pleasure to invite Angela Miller to join me, and please give her a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? It's good. Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. And I wanted to thank Matilda, as well as Richard and the American Folk Art Museum for this really wonderful exhibition, which I had a chance to see a few weeks ago, and it is truly transformative. So thank you to everyone, and I'm honored to be here. I'm going to start with a very brief introduction to the session, and then to the three speakers, and then present a sort of summary or discussion afterwards of a few minutes before we enter into questions among the panelists and also for the audience. So I'll be giving that brief commentary afterwards. But for now, let me say that this session on remapping modernisms considers several Brazilian and Afro-Brazilian as well as Jamaican artists who all of them are situated within a hemispheric framework that generates, I think, really important comparative possibilities as well as points of difference. So we have a lot to learn from this hemispheric framework that is being introduced in this next session, and how it moves us beyond a kind of narrowly nationalist approach to one that looks at US arts within a hemispheric framework in a way that increasing numbers of scholars, I think, are calling for. These artists that we're going to be looking at in these three talks all enact a critical relationship to the nation state as well as to the post-colonial cultures of their respective societies. And they also establish, they also call into question the canonical status of modernism within established institutions. So that's the range of talks that we're going to hear. I've been asked to keep these introductions fairly brief. There will be longer introductions included in the chat. Included in the chat for you. Let me start by introducing Nicole Smythe-Johnson. Our first speaker is a writer and independent curator from Kingston, Jamaica. She is working on her PhD at the University of Texas in Austin, where she's actually writing about the artist she's going to be speaking about today, John Dunkley. Nicole's curatorial work includes the Kingston Biennial in Jamaica, and also work on an exhibition that she actually did on John Dunkley that opened in Miami, but also at the American Folk Art Museum. Nicole writes for Flash Art and Small Acts, among other publications, and she's also the editor of the Caribbean Quarterly. Rodrigo Moura is a writer, editor, and curator. He's our second speaker, and like Julia Bryan-Wilson, both of them have worked at the Museo de Arte São Paulo and also at the Instituto Inhotim, among others in Brazil. Rodrigo currently lives in New York, and he's the curator, one of the chief curator at El Museo del Barrio in New York City. Julia Bryan-Wilson, who will give the third talk, is professor of art history and LGBTQ+ studies at Columbia University. Julia is also curator at large, like Rodrigo. She's curator at large at the Museo de Arte in Sao Paulo. And her books include the award-winning Frey, Art and Textile Politics. And we also look forward to her forthcoming book on Louise Nevelson. So with that, I will hand over the first speaker, Nicole.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you to the organizers for putting all this together, and to the other presenters. It's been a really interesting and thought-provoking day of presentations. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen. Let's make sure that. Okay, great. The only record we have of anything John Dunkley ever said is about his artwork. Dunkley told Philip Sherlock, secretary of the Institute of Jamaica between 1939 and 1944, "When I do a painting, I am taking a walk." This paper and the tributary of my research it summarizes unfolds from that statement. The presentation follows Dunkley on one of his walks and sketches out the peculiar geography of his route. Even after more than 5 years researching John Dunkley's life and artwork, I have never been sure what to make of going to market. In a move of strange paintings, it is among the strangest. In the foreground, a dark-skinned man stands behind a donkey, looking wearily out from under the brim of his hat. His arm rests on the back of the donkey, who is loaded with a basket. The figure is not rendered in great detail. The black lines depicting his facial features are barely visible against his almost equally black skin. And we cannot tell what is in the basket, but details are unnecessary. The native man with donkey has been a trope of Jamaican representation since the 1890s, and efforts by the colonial government and tourism interests to constitute a new idea of Jamaica. Krista Thompson introduces her study of early photography in the Anglophone Caribbean, An Eye for the Tropics, with her encounter with a contemporary staging of the Man and Donkey at Dunn's River Falls, a tourist attraction on Jamaica's north coast. The passage indicates both the persistence of tropicalized representations from this late 19th and early 20th century period, and the specifically photographic nature of such images. She writes, "The native man with donkey was a stock character in many photographic representations of the Anglophone Caribbean, taken during the late 19th century and early 20th. The icon had been imprinted on numerous photographs and postcards since the start of the tourism industry in the 1890s. More than a century later, the man at Dunn's River Falls made his living by transforming himself and his donkey into this age-old image, itself likely based on past representations, in order to elicit the interest of tourists, who would then, in turn, render him into yet another photographic image." Born in 1891, just over 2 generations after the Emancipation Proclamation in the British colonies in 1834, Dunkley came of age in a time of transition and economic uncertainty. With the decline of King Sugar, local elites were looking for a new economic vision for the island. If Jamaica was no longer a sugar plantation colony powered by slavery, what was it? The banana industry, which would come to be called green gold, and tourism became important ingredients in answering that question. Led by Henry Blake, the island's British governor from 1889 to 1897, they called this new vision the New Jamaica. Photography was an important tool in constructing and presenting the fertile, civilized, and open for business New Jamaica that the colonial government hoped to bring into being. New Jamaica representations were an effort to quell the post-emancipation fears of potential travelers and white settlers who saw the tropics and the Caribbean as places of wild nature and unruly natives. Instead, New Jamaica image represented the island as potentially profitable for investors and tamed, safe, and artfully cultivated for tourists. Or to use other terms, New Jamaica representations were part of a pictorial program that transformed the American tropics from nature at her most dangerous, the white man's grave, to nature at her most loving, paradise. With reference to Coconut Palms by A. Dupley and Sons and James Johnston's Seen on the Rio Cobre, photographs used to market Jamaica in a widely sold album and a traveling lantern show, respectively, Thompson summarizes the features and functions of New Jamaica imagery. Photographs and written accounts of the New Jamaica frequently described, visualized, or fetishized parts of the island's vegetation that displayed signs of cultivation, generally aspects of the landscape that had been overhauled and transplanted by various colonial regimes and North American and British business interests for profit. Such images naturalize the island's past and present plantation landscapes and attendant agricultural products of colonial cultivation as indigenous, aesthetically pleasing, and characteristic parts of the island's environment. She then traces the history of New Jamaica imagery to two visual genres used in earlier representations of Jamaica: imperial picturesque landscapes of the late 18th century and naturalist painting of the 19th century. The imperial picturesque emerged in Jamaica at the height of sugar production in the colony, a period of great economic prosperity for Jamaica's plantocracy, but also of emerging abolitionist activism within England. Imperial picturesque landscapes were generally commissioned by planters who hired British painters to produce imagery that might counter the flood of abolitionist imagery being produced in England at the time. The infamous diagram of the Brooke slave ship, seen here, being among the best known of these. In the imperial picturesque, the picturesque genre's commitment to the depiction of natural spaces untouched by human cultivation was reconciled with the highly constructed landscape of the sugar plantation. Plantation landscapes were not only shaped by fields of sugarcane and later bananas, they were also defined by the many other plants that were brought to Jamaica as part of colonial transplantation projects, yet have become and remain emblematic of the island's tropicality. Royal palms, coconut palms, citrus, mangoes, tamarind, banana, hibiscus, and even sugar were all brought to Jamaica from other parts of the globe between the 17th and 19th centuries. The history of those transplantations and the indigenous environments that were raised to produce them are part of the violent re-landscaping that went hand in hand with the colonial project. Yet, imperial picturesque paintings like View of Port Maria by British artist James Hakewill, seen here, presented the violently overhauled landscape as natural, and in fact, nature's most perfectly imaginable manifestation. This had the dual outcomes of naturalizing what Michael Dash has called the radical modernization from the outside, that was the colonial project, and allowed planters to claim credit for their roles in realizing the landscape's ideal form. The genre's preference for the loitering peasant over the industrious mechanic in the British context also meant that through the picturesque lens, the enslaved were represented at ease, their conditions equal to or superior to the generality of the working classes of the free communities of Europe, as Hakewill would note in his few remarks on the moral condition of Jamaica, which accompanied his A Picturesque Tour of the Island of Jamaica in 1825. In naturalist paintings of the 19th century, the second progenitor of New Jamaica imagery, naturalists produced images of Jamaican flora with attention to the peculiar and eccentric, yet presented them as typical through systemization in naturalist grids. The impact of this in Jamaica, but also throughout the Caribbean and Latin America, was a form of representation that reinforced fantasies of the tropics, heightening and exoticizing the island's vegetation, while legitimizing tropical fantasies as reality through their interpretation as scientific, objective, and real. British painter Marianne North, whose work we see here, considered herself a naturalist who studied nature through paint. And when American artist John Martin Head exhibited his paintings of Jamaica in Boston, a heated debate on the veracity of the images unfolded, with one reviewer concluding that Head's images presented nature as it is in the tropics. These two earlier forms of representation come together and are translated into photography in images of the New Jamaica. In the aftermath of emancipation, banana plantations replaced sugar ones, and tourism, facilitated by easier travel and often funded by agricultural interests, became an important nascent industry. The United Fruit Company, which by 1900 owned approximately 12,266 acres in Jamaica, built the Titchfield Hotel in 1897 and bought the Myrtlebank Hotel in Kingston in 1918. British competitor Elder Dempster and Company also owned the Constant Spring Hotel in Kingston and set up the Imperial Direct Line, a direct cargo and passenger service to Liverpool, hoping to compete with the United Fruit Company's Great White Fleet. Jamaica's new elite, a combination of British colonial administrators, mercantile elite, and British and North American business interests, deployed the visual vocabulary inherited from imperial picturesque and naturalist paintings through the new form of photography. Thompson notes that where the picturesque New Jamaica differed most dramatically from the imperial picturesque was not in picturing tropical commodities, but in being commodities. Photographs presented the island's newest agricultural imports while simultaneously fulfilling the role of tourism's product. Going to Market participates in that economy of representations of Jamaica. It is one of several Dunkley paintings that seems to reference postcards or other mass media photography, drawing on the New Jamaica visual vocabulary. We also have the defined background, middle distance, and foreground, a path that leads the viewer through them, and the loitering peasant of picturesque representation. Yet the painting is not reminiscent of Hakevil's view of Port Maria. The painting's limited palette of black, white, green, reddish brown, and mustard yellow is consistent with most of Dunkley's oeuvre and seems informed by hand-colored photography of the period. The painting's harsh and unnatural rendering of light also suggests photography, perhaps a camera's flash, placing it firmly in New Jamaica territory. Yet where most of the painting borrows from New Jamaica tropes, there's also a deliberate disruption of that representational strategy. The path that draws the eye up the canvas and into the image is abruptly cut off by a separate field, marked off with a white chalk-like line and occupied by a cactus plant that seems to burst forth from nowhere. The kinds of vegetation in the rest of the painting, the loose textural forms on the hill, the philodendron-like leaves of the hedge, and the mint green bush in the bottom right corner are typical of Dunkley's paintings. They occur in Frog Among the Rocks and Woodland, for example. But the cactus is an unusual and jarring aberration. Any attempt to integrate it with the rest of the scene is thwarted by the white line that splits the upper half of the painting in two. Where the rest of the image depicts an outdoor landscape, the yellow and blue sky in the top left-hand corner suggesting daytime, the cactus is surrounded by a featureless darkness, as though photographed in a studio. For a long time, I dismissed this small, strange painting. Was it incomplete? Had Dunkley been in the process of painting over the more conventional landscape, but never finished the transformation? It was not until I was presenting my dissertation prospectus during a seminar in Latin American history, in which I was the only participant who was not from the Spanish-speaking Americas, that a Mexican colleague pointed out that the cactus reminded him of the nopal in the Mexican coat of arms. The opuntia cactus, also known as prickly pear, tuna, or nopal from the Nahuatl word nopali, is distinguished by its red fruit. It is indigenous to the Americas and is most common in the central and western regions of Mexico and the arid and drought-prone western and south central US, where the leaves and fruit are part of regional cuisine and folklore. While Jamaica hosts an array of ecosystems, including sandy coastal environments where opuntia might grow, cacti are not widespread in Jamaica, nor are they part of the way the island has been traditionally pictured. That is to say, cacti are not among the colonial transplants that have come to index tropicality, palms, bananas, mangoes, etc. They do, however, have placemaking status in Central America. The plant's inclusion in the Mexican coat of arms refers to the story of the founding of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, built on the site of modern-day Mexico City. The story goes that the Aztec deity, Huitzilopochtli, told the then nomadic Aztec to look for an eagle devouring a snake perched on a prickly pear cactus, and that should be the site of their new city. Though the story positions the nopal within Mexican history, it is important to note that the nopal is indigenous to and found throughout the Americas. It is a plant that has been incorporated into our national myth, but its significance precedes and exceeds the nation state. Dunkley's representation of the nopal, with its naturalist overtones, the incongruent scale, the detailed rendering of its prickly pods and flower-like fruits, invites attention to an investigation of the plant's physiology and significance. If naturalist painting renders the typical through depictions of the specific, one wonders, where is this plant typical? A close look at this small painting, it is only around 20 by 14 inches, also rewards with a stray pad off the lower right of the cactus. It grows from a patch of dark green, almost as dark as the black around it. The green seems to emerge from the black, an underlayer left unpainted so that we might see through. Are there other cactus back there in the darkness? What hole is this cactus growing through? And what is it a hole in? To think about naturalist painting's deployment in the tropics also brings the whole history of naturalist travel to the New World into the frame. Since as early as 16 years after the British claimed possession of Jamaica in 1655, naturalists ventured to the region. The region here extends beyond the islands of the Caribbean or the British West Indies. After his sojourn in Jamaica, he would continue on to Brazil. And in summarizing Nancy Stepan's Picturing Tropical Nature, Thompson discusses Latin America and the Caribbean as one region, noting that both areas held a particular allure for naturalists, as the region was singled out as a locale in which nature reigned supreme and manifested itself in ways completely different from vegetation in temperate zones. The picturesque elements of the painting also operate through their genre to conjure the space of the tropical Americas. There too, however, the representative strategy precedes and exceeds national boundary and disciplinary subfield. As Thompson points out, the roots of the picturesque reach back through 18th and 19th century Britain to painters of 17th century Italian landscapes, Nicolas Poussin and Salvatore Rosa. The native man with donkey trope also has currency throughout the tropical Americas, as this internet advertisement and postcard from 1930s Mexico indicates. Yet, as Catherine Cox reminds us in her discussion of the use of tropical to refer to places that do not lie between the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn, tropical is not a strictly geographic designation. It refers to places with tropical traits, that is, waving palms, slothful Negroes, odd tropical fruits, and early venturings on the part of buccaneers from Spain. Cox suggests the term Southland to refer to the global tourist South, which extends across Florida, Southern California, Mexico, and the Caribbean. My point then is not to suggest that Dunkley was referencing Mexico specifically, though he could have been. Jamaican newspapers reported on the Mexican Revolution regularly, and Cassie Dunkley tells us that Dunkley traveled to England, Scotland, North and South America, and numerous other places as a sailor. I focus my discussion on this painting because talking about it demonstrates the kind of analysis that thinking with Dunkley requires. In order to take this strange painting seriously, to refuse to write it off as an error or a bit of whimsy on Dunkley's part requires thinking across a well-maintained boundary between Latin American and US history and art history. It requires conjuring a frame in which this painting might make sense. And in this painting that makes such deliberate use of representational strategies long used for placemaking, I'm drawn to think about what geography it renders. I argue that it is a Black geography. To make this clear, let us look briefly at the geographies generally considered in scholarship on interwar modernism in the Americas. Generally, American modernists were engaged in a transatlantic conversation, which they often encounter through travel. This is true if you look north, as Wanda Corn's The Great American Thing, Modern Art and National Identity does, tracing the transatlantic tensions and connections that fed the circle of early US modernists that gathered around Alfred Stieglitz. It is also true in Central and South America, where canonical modernists like Mexico's Diego Rivera, Brazil's Tarsila do Amaral, and Uruguayan Joaquin Torres Garcia all studied in Europe before returning home to spearhead Mexican muralism, anthropophagia, and universal constructivism, respectively. The North and South are also generally discussed separately. Dunkley, on the other hand, was part of a generation of West Indians whose lives were shaped by circum-Caribbean travel. At the crossroads between Central America and the US and Europe since the 19th century, 17 steamship lines passed through the port of Kingston by the turn of the century. Between 1904 and 1914, over 100,000 Jamaicans traveled to or through the Isthmian port of Colon, many on their way to work on the US-backed construction of the Panama Canal, but also further afield to Chiriquí and Bocas del Toro in Panama, San Juan del Sur and Bluefields in Nicaragua, Tela in Honduras, and Guatemala, Mexico, and as far as New Orleans to the north, or south to Santa Marta in Colombia and cities in Venezuela, Ecuador, and Brazil. 60,000 Jamaicans went to Cuba between 1919 and 1921, when post-war US investment in Cuban sugar increased prices and attracted migrant labor from across the West Indies. This out of a population of just over 830,000 in 1911. As historian Lara Putnam tells us, it was a mobile world. It was also a time of massive political change. Putnam describes the circum-Caribbean migratory sphere as defined by working class men and women who left their islands of birth at the margins of the British Empire at the dawn of the 20th century to seek work in ports and plantations at the leading edge of a new empire, the informal empire of the United States. This mobile geography, though in many ways peripheral, was key to the rise of Black internationalisms from Garvey to Malcolm X. Though these migrant laborers, from the point of view of one imperial state, the British Empire, one neo-imperial state, the US government, and many republican states of the Spanish-speaking Circum-Caribbean, for these various states, Black Caribbean workers were utterly marginal, enjoying few de facto political rights on their islands of origin, and fewer still in the lands where they sojourned. Yet, Putnam notes that of the 40 key political leaders from across Africa and the diaspora, whom Hakeem Adi and Marika Sherwood selected as central to Pan-African history from 1787 to the present, fully 1/4 were born in the British Caribbean during the late 19th and early 20th century and came of age in the heyday of the Circum-Caribbean migratory sphere. In Jamaica specifically, Circum-Caribbean returnees were key protagonists of social movements foundational to Jamaican nation formation, including the birth of Rastafari. And here in this painting by Dunkley Mountain Edge, we see the Pan-Africanist tricolor under the bridge there, and the black sun that is setting or rising is believed to refer to Marcus Garvey, who at this point has just died. And the 1938 labor rebellion. And here we have Sir Alexander Bustamante, who was a major part of those labor rebellions and later goes on to become prime minister and a national hero depicted in this other Dunkley painting. The awkwardness of this painting then makes sense when we consider Alex Moulton and Inge Salo's summary of Black geography's scholarship. Grappling with the geographies of Blackness is not merely a matter of excavating Black landscapes overlaid by Eurocentric landscape histories, but also of explicating how such landscapes have been conceived of as a nowhere or outside. This painting is strange because it's a depiction of the nowhere that linked Jamaica with not just Mexico or even Central America, but the Americas. The Circum-Caribbean migratory sphere that appears in Dunkley's oeuvre in Going to Market, Banana Plantation, Cuban scenery, Panama scenery. President Roosevelt gazed at Portland Bight, in which he appears critical of American interests in Jamaica. And even Jerboa, which is believed to reference the divisional insignia of the British 8th Army's 7th Armored Division, whose victories were reported on in the Daily Cleaner in August 1944, are coordinates of that Black geography, the geography that provides the grounds for Dunkley's subaltern modernism. A modernism that articulated itself not from the perspective of trade routes, telegraph lines, and canals that shaped American modernity. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank Valerie Russo and Mathilde Walker-Bilot and everyone else in the American Folk Art Museum for the invitation to be here today and share with you about my interest in the field of self-taught modernism, especially in Brazil, where I did some research and curated exhibitions around the theme, some of which we'll discuss during this talk today. Thanks also, Angela, for the introduction, and my fellow panelists here today. It's been a really wonderful day, full of learnings, full of very interesting thoughts and discussions, extremely enriching. So I thank everybody who shared their presentations here today. I'll just go ahead and share my screen. Yeah, so I would like to start the presentation by sharing about a project that I presented at El Museu del Barrio, where I serve as chief curator, Popular Painters and Other Visionaries. This is going to be the first part of this presentation. Then I'll move into some specific cases in the Brazilian context. So Popular Painters and Other Visionaries at El Museu del Barrio started, it's one of the first exhibitions I proposed upon joining the museum. It started as a result of studying the collection of the museum and going into more knowledge about the holdings of El Museu in in art of the mid-century of the 20th century. So, so it started, the original idea was to make it into a collection-only exhibition in the year of 2021. And because of the pandemic, we changed that idea into an online show. And this, what you see here, is the homepage of that of that online exhibition. This was first planned as a collection show, and then it turned into an online exhibition, including virtual loans from museums and private collections. And this is interesting because when you think, if you can just stay there for a second, when you think of El Museu's relationship with modern art, it's a museum that doesn't really hold a canonical collection of modern art, such as other museums in New York City or in the United States or anywhere in the world. So because it's a museum that it's doesn't have a specific period or doesn't have a direct commitment to an art movement or to an art period, it became it is a museum that collected this material in a way completely different than other museums. So I was especially very interested by these holdings, and I proposed to do the show that turned into this online project. So maybe just showing briefly the associations that were proposed in the show. We had 30 schooled and self-taught artists who worked in different parts of the Americas and the Caribbean between the 1930s and the 70s. The exhibition departs from the terms popular painters to identify artists working on the margins of modernism and the mainstream art world. Popular visual sources provide the narrative thread of the exhibition. The slide we're seeing now, it's actually it's a slide of when we brought the show back into the brick and mortar in real life in 2021, and we then we made a third version beyond the the online version, including works from the collection and actual loans. So 4 thematic sections around labor, daily life, festivities, religion, vernacular architecture, and bodily representations. In addition to these themes, 4 artists were presented in monographic sections, as well as in the online version: Andrés Kurucic, Martin Ramirez, José Bernardo Cardoso, and Felipe Jesus Gonçalves. Something common in the show is that the common experience of diaspora, whether as African populations in the New World, Latin American and Caribbean people in the United States, or in reference to the displacement of Amerindian populations within their own territories in the Americas. So it was an exhibition that reflected in the impact of immigration, exclusion, marginalization in the works of these artists, as well as indigeneity, self-determination, and autobiography. And this is a point where most of these artists and their aesthetic language have been described, historically as naive or primitive labels that we rejected as pejorative. And then thus we brought the popular painters with all its histories and all its connotations as this unifying label to look at artists that were working simultaneously between the 30s, 60s, and the 60s, late 30s into the late 60s, around in different parts of the America, in the margins of modernism in different parts of the America. So on this installation view, we see left to right the works of Horace Pippin, Monsieur Stéphane, and Heitor dos Prazeres, work in the United States, in Haiti, and in Brazil as 3 artists from the African diaspora in the Americas, dealing with different, through different language, but with similar interests in their autobiographies and in their lived experiences in most cases. So if you can go just next to the next slide. Right, so there we have another section of the exhibition with works by Rafael Borges de Oliveira, Jacques Richard Chéry, and Pierre-Joseph Valsin and Benoit Rigaud. So on the left, an artist in Brazil, and the three artists on the right from Haiti, from the Port-au-Prince School of Painting, Haiti School of Painting, working together in that context and around Afro-diasporic religion and spirituality. So this is a point in common of them as, you know, practitioners, artists that very early on in modern history have started to infuse these experiences in the work of Rafael Borges de Oliveira. On the left, we have a scene of a hunting of Oxóssi, an imagined scene of a hunting of the Orisha Oxóssi. This is likely a painting that he created for his ritual site. He was also a candomblé priest out in Bahia. And on the right, we have different depictions of rituals as well as mystical visions by three Haitian artists. So we can go to the next slide now, please. Yes, so this is also a part of the same section of the exhibition where we had the works of Minnie Evans, Louisiane Saint-Florent, and Consuelo Chelo Amezcua, Chelo Gonzalez Amezcua, in dialogue with a common interest in embellishment and other decorative techniques to represent female figures in their work. And finally, we can go to the next slide. Yeah, and this is the second part of the presentation. I'm sorry, this is I had a more complete slideshow here. I can try to show other slides later on in the conversation part. As part of my work in Brazil, I worked at Museu de Arte de São Paulo, MASP, as an adjunct curator of Brazilian art, where I organized several shows around self-taught Brazilian artists in the especially 40s and 50s. So on this part of the presentation, I'm presenting some of the artists that were part of this program and some others who were part of this, whole movement of reconsideration on the part of the current Brazilian scene, on artists that were very present in Brazilian modernism between the 40s and the 50s, especially, and starting in the late 30s, but that somehow got disconnected from a more official art history and were erased from this more official art history. I will say that I will start with José Antônio da Silva, who was an artist from rural São Paulo, who worked in the rural setting for several years. He was working the plantations of cotton in the interior of São Paulo, in the countryside. And then this is a recurring structure of interaction between the mainstream and this so-called self-taught artists, where they get discovered by a white critic, a male critic from a mainstream structure. So in the case of José Antônio da Silva, he was first showing his work in his hometown, participating in an exhibition in 1946, and his paintings called the attention of critics such as Lorival Gomes Machado, Paulo Mendes de Almeida, and who were there as jurors to the exhibition where he was showing. And immediately right after, he starts to show in São Paulo. 1 year later, he has a show at the MASP, Museu de Arte de São Paulo, acquires his work, and the Museum of Modern Art in São Paulo publishes his book. He was just 40 years old then, but the novel of my life, where he writes about his upbringing and his becoming how he became an artist, But Silva is a very interesting artist because he was also very involved with the São Paulo Biennial. So both Museu de Arte Moderna, Museu of Modern Art, and Museu de Arte de São Paulo, São Paulo Art Museum, they both had initially an interest for the self-taught artists. Silva was probably the earlier case, but also the Bienal de São Paulo in 1951 started to promote and show these artists, which was also an interesting way, a negotiation between the so-called like fine arts and more Eurocentric artists or circuits and these artists. So the Bienal de São Paulo, and we can go to the next slide. And he showed in several Bienais de São Paulo, but then years later, he became very upset that he was being excluded from such exhibitions, and he started to do the self-portraits where he represents himself with the sayings, with this text accompanying his figures. Sometimes he would represent the critics or the jurors, but here we have like an entire like a full self-portrait on the left where he say, "I hate the São Paulo biennials." So on the right we have another. It's a detail of a self-portrait where we see his mouth covered, and he writes, "Look at this mouth. It was the biennial that tied it up." So he was also referring to how sometimes tense and not necessarily very harmonious these relationships would be between the artists, especially in the case of Silva and the Bienal de São Paulo. Next slide, please. Yeah, now we can talk about Agostinho Batista de Freitas, who was also, in this case, he was an immigrant from Portugal, from the Azores Islands, who came very young to Brazil, and he was an electrician. He lived in the outskirts of São Paulo. And that's a very interesting myth of origin in the history. The images we're seeing here is, of course, Freitas on the left, having one of his famous aerial views of São Paulo on the left, and on the right we have some installation views of the exhibition Agostinho Batista de Freitas in São Paulo that I co-curated with Fernando Oliva, another curator at MASP in 2016. And we see there the very beautiful museography that Lina Bobardi, one of the creators of MASP and an exhibition designer and architect and writer, thinker, who she designed this exhibition display, this museography, for the 100 Masterworks of Portinari, an exhibition that was presented in the MASP then new building in 1970, and we repurposed it for the Agostinho Batista de Freitas. But back to this sort of myth of origin or genesis of Agostinho's relationship with MASP. The story goes that Lina's husband and MASP's founder, Pietro Maria Bardi, was walking on the street, and he met this young man selling his paintings, and he was like absolutely fascinated. And he said, "Oh, I will grant you access to the rooftop of a very tall building, Edifício Martinelli, in downtown São Paulo, which is also an icon of the modernization of the city. And if you paint a very nice painting, if you succeed, I'll give you a show in the museum." And so he did. He had a show in 1953 at MASP. I think several so-called self-taught artists had their shows in this beginning of the museum. Both Bardi and Lina were champions of self-taught artists, and they were part of what Pietro Maria Bardi formulated as this notion of the museum without adjectives, a museum of art without adjectives. So not modern, not contemporary, not fine arts, for instance, but influenced by ideas where different forms of art and different artists coming from different backgrounds could coexist under this concept of a museum So if you can just have a look at the next view, next slide, please, Richard. Thank you so much. So yeah, so there we have the famous view, one of the famous views that was part of MASP's shows in 1953, in a later version of this aerial views of São Paulo that became so much identified with Freitas's work. And it's very interesting because this painting that he created as part of this challenge that Bardi proposed to him never entered the collection of the museum. It's part of Bardi's private collection, and the museum didn't collect a work by Freitas until the time of the exhibition we curated in 2016, when the museum started to collect it. So next slide, please. Yeah, we're going to talk also about the case of Alfredo Volpi, an artist that was also included in Popular Painters and Other Visionaries with this painting. On the right, an artist that started to show his work in the 1930s. He was part of different groups of so-called labor or like working class vanguards in São Paulo, Grupo Santa Helena, groups that were made of artists who were all immigrants, born in, Volpi was born in Lucca, in Italy, immigrated to São Paulo, to Brazil, to São Paulo very young, to the neighborhood of Cambuci in São Paulo, and lived there his entire life. But he was producing this figurative work until the 50s, and he had a very interesting transition between styles, and the work becomes very it gets more essentialized, it gets more simplified, it gets more abstract, no? And until he becomes like a sacred cow of geometric abstraction in the context of Brazilian art. But there was a show so maybe we can, this is 1943, the next painting is 1955, where we see how, he was really simplifying a lot of his forms. This one of his famous facades, well, gorgeous one. But all the narrative elements of the Festa de São João disappear, and the work becomes more modern in the terms of the discussions that were taking place in Brazil around that time, after the implementation of the São Paulo Biennial in 1951. But it marks right after this period. Volpi has a show at Museu de Arte Moderna of Rio de Janeiro, Museum of Modern Art of Rio, in 1957, where Mário Pedrosa, who was already a very influential critic, and he had been for many years a big champion of the constructive avant-gardes already at that time in Rio, he says that Volpi is the biggest master of Brazilian painting, and his career has a completely different development after that. So again, Pedrosa being one of these other figures, we talk about Lina and Bardi, we talk about the São Paulo critics who discovered, this myth of the discovery is a recurring theme in Brazilian modernism. Silva, in this case, Pedrosa being a very key person in Volpi's career, specifically at this point. So maybe we can go to the next slide. Where we're gonna finish the presentation. I'm gonna focus more on the work. I think I can share my screen now because I have an even newer slides. So if you don't mind, I'll just use my slides for the Janira. And I appreciate everybody's flexibility and patience as I go through this process of sharing my presentation with you today. Let me just go straight to the slides in question. Yes, thank you. Let me share my screen real quick here. Yeah, so I hope you're seeing it. Yeah, so on the left we see Janira da Mota Silva, who would sign her paintings only Janira. So this is why we call her Janira. In the title of the exhibition we presented of her work at MASP in 2019. We see again installation views there, where we see a lot of labor scenes, both from artisanal trades, the rural setting, and as well as this wall in the bottom, which is her very late period, where we see her representations of mining, of the mining industry and the mining labors, both in iron ore, charcoal, and calcareous minerals in different regions of Brazil. So Janira, she had that really drive to travel. She used to travel to, most of her paintings are the result of, you know, her direct traveling through Brazil. And the question of the Brazilian landscape is something that Pedrosa also identified very early as an important component. Pedrosa wrote twice, Mario Pedrosa wrote twice about Janira, once in the 40s, the next time in 1958. And on the second time, she revisits the work of Janira. She says, Janira, what happened, whatever is left of her primitivism. So a very interesting component of this relationship between the critic and self-taught artist. Janira never attended, she had like very few drawing classes in Rio, but she was a seamstress. She was also, she was cooking at a boarding house where she had exposed in Santa Teresa, which was a very dynamic artistic neighborhood in Rio during the war. And so she started to work in 1940. And she's not only self-taught, but she's self-made in a very interesting way. And she also infused a lot of identity tropes in her work. Maybe we can have a look at the next slide, please. Oh, that's me doing, sorry. Yeah, so we're seeing now here, it's just a page of the publication of MASP that we did as part of the project, where we compare here Janira's very early work with the work of Cândido Portinari. The same here between Janira and 1920s Tarsila do Amaral. So just to sort of show how she was very aware of this popular thematic being one that was part of the 1920s and 30s modern movements in Brazil, but she was somehow pushing forward and making it more the core of her work, the popular themes. And this is an interesting, I think I would like to bring this to as an interesting component of my presentation today. Her brief but very meaningful, not that brief, but sojourn in New York. So Janira came here in 1945. Under her own expenses, she self-funded her trip. She had no money, zero money. There's several accounts of this trip, but she came to New York in 1945. She was following another Brazilian painter, Milton da Costa, they were in a romantic relationship at the time. And da Costa had won a prize to, like a travel prize of the Brazilian salons, where Janira showed constantly between 1940 and 45 too, and later on. And Janira came to New York, and because da Costa was here, and da Costa ended up leaving to Portugal, because it was a time that was still very difficult to travel to Europe. But Janira stayed here, and she stayed for almost 2 years. And Maria Martins, the famous sculptor, was also in New York at the time, and she was very supportive of Janira, and she faced like the very difficult circumstances during her stay here. But she produced a number of works, and this is like a fabulous painting that she produced around that time, circa 1945.
Wrap up, please. Thank you.
Excuse me, can you repeat that? I have to wrap?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yeah, and so great, no problem. So this is a painting that was, so she had a show at the New School for Social Research. Her archives at the Funarte, the Foundation Brazilian for the Arts in Rio, another institution created in the 40s and in Brazil. And in here we see the clipping of her show at the Art Digest, and also the little leaflet that was produced for that show. And this is just an example, sorry, of how she was representing work, labor in Brazilian rural setting, but also bringing that together in the mid to late 50s to a more geometric and constructivism idiom. So this is, I'm so sorry for the beginning of my presentation was a little convoluted, but I'm open to any questions, and I thank you all for your attention.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for that, Rodrigo. And thank you to everyone for being here. Especially, I send my gratitude to Matilda and Richard for organizing this. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully that will happen. Let's see, one participant. Yeah, hold on. And then I go here. How does that look to everybody?
Looks great.
Okay, fantastic. So, right. Though Madalena Santos Reinbold had worked extensively with a variety of creative practices since she was a young child, in 1969, she abruptly stopped using paint and started embroidering, using acrylic wool yarn on burlap to create dazzlingly complex designs. This turn away from the brush to needle happened relatively late in her life when she was 50 years old. But in fact, this shift in medium was less a rupture than a return, for Santos Reinbold had grown up steeped in textile handicrafts during her childhood, growing up on a farm in Bahia, where her mother spun cotton, sewed clothes, and produced lace alongside her work in pottery. And Bahia, which is in the northeast of Brazil, was the locus of the Afro-Atlantic slave trade and remains a vital center of Black culture. Her wool pictures, as they are often called, depict vignettes from her rural agrarian past in which human figures, animals, plants, and structures from the built environment create densely interlocking scenes. Many of her fibrous ravels of thread gesture towards landscapes and communal life, though sometimes they're difficult to entirely decipher. More rarely, they feature colorful abstract shapes that are as reminiscent of everyday rugs, blankets, and patterned garments as they are of the elite rarefied modernist art that hung on the walls in the wealthy urban houses where, starting at the age of 20, she worked as a cook and a house cleaner. And today I'll examine Santos Reinbold's use of needlework to speculate about how we can embellish or embroider art history with a more decisive attention to the material entanglements of race, class, and gender, particularly around the question of the decorative. Santos Reinbold's energetic embroideries, which she continued to refine for approximately 6 years, from 1969 until her death, have been noted for their connections to African diasporic traditions and for their fit within the Brazilian term arte popular, which Rodrigo just helpfully kind of outlined a little bit, which is making by uncredentialed people, usually who have been marginalized for reasons of race, education, ability, and class. Initially treated as quote unquote primitive, with all the terms patronizing and exoticizing fascination, her creative impulse as a Black woman to visually transform the world around her was regarded first as a distraction by her rich white lesbian lover employers, the US poet Elizabeth Bishop and the Brazilian modernist architect Lota Sorayas, and later as their discovery. In a letter from 1952, Elizabeth Bishop wrote, "While we were away, the cook took up painting, proving that art only flourishes in leisure time, I guess. And she's turned out to be a really wonderful primitive. So we shall soon start peddling her on 57th Street and making our fortunes." Lota told her to please clean the garbage pail. She is half savage and very dirty, although a very fine cook. And 10 minutes later, we found it painted in violent reds and pinks and blacks. Bishop's letters, rife with racist condescension about her employee, track her awareness of Santos Reinbold's creative practice as one of a determined desire to color the objects around her. And she also mentions her maids painted stones that translated their abstract mossy patterns into creatures. Many of Santos Reinbold's early experiments from the 50s, including works on paper and painted stones, are now lost, having been discarded as useless. And I'll come back to this, the problem of the kind of lost archive, early archive. And this painting is from about a decade after she was employed by Bishop and Sorayas. And I will note that there's a lot of there's a lot of lacuna in the archive around Santos Reinbold. We have really only very partial and spotty chronologies. And part of what I'm interested in thinking about is how we construct histories even if we lack proper evidence. So the poet expresses some surprise in her maid's talent and immediately lays claim of ownership to it. Santos Reinbold's natural flair is by turns acknowledged, mocked, and speculatively monetized, all while the artist is characterized as relentless in her quote, in her violent besmirching of the garbage can, containing trash that she was apparently triply aligned with as their Black lower class female house servant. As a live-in cook and cleaner whose private life was constantly surveyed by her employers, Santos Reinbold and her activities both in and out of the kitchen were monitored, scrutinized, and policed. She did not have the privilege of doing her non-remunerative labor in a sphere separate from her job. Bishop's phrase about Santos Reinbold making her art during a time of leisure is a willful misreading of the economics of this type of domestic employment, where there is virtually no downtime. In fact, her artistic pursuits ultimately interfered with her status as a worker, and she was fired by Bishop because her churning creativity upset the peace of the household. Around 1969, Santos Reinbold changed her materials from paint to textiles. Her decisive turn to the needle and burlap sack was precipitated in part by health and hygiene concerns. The smell of paint and constant hand washing it necessitated became too much for her. But as I mentioned, she had always embroidered. Mending cloth and ornamenting domestic items such as dish towels were part and parcel of her paid work. Unlike the designs that she stitched for her bosses, who sketched out what they wanted, Santos Reinbold's method was freehand and improvisational, and she conceptualized her imagery in her mind rather than plotting it out on the fabric in advance. As her method developed, as she made these embroideries from roughly 1969 till 1977, and again, the chronologies are not certain, she approached her compositions in a highly complex fashion, keeping at hand over 150 different needles prepared for use, with which she created her elaborate pieces, mainly comprised of thickets of straight stitches. Owing to her precarious economic circumstances, she frequently utilized what others discarded, embracing scraps, leftovers, and remainders, including deploying cotton waste bags as her support, a choice that guided the size and rectilinear format of most of her embroideries. Her work has been contextualized within studies of Brazilian textiles. For instance, a foundational text on the subject from 1978 features a detail of a piece by her on its cover. And within this book, her embroideries are called wool pictures. Yet terming these pieces wool pictures, they're sometimes called yarn paintings, demonstrates some of the embarrassment that still clings to the word embroidery, as these fancier phrases attempt to remove her handicraft from the material, gendered, social realities of this lowlier genre and secure for it the contested category of art. Indeed, it is imperative for an intersectional feminist art history that we do not keep adding embroideries to the canon of art by exception or by acts of renaming, as in the claim, well, actually she was painting, but just happened to be using fiber, but rather that we move to expand or even dismantle the category of fine art, which was a masculinist Renaissance European invention meant to exclude lower classes, non-white racialized subjects, and many women from its vaunted realms. And in this regard, though she focused mainly on Britain and a handful of other Western European sites, the Marxist feminist Rosika Parker and her work on the gendering of embroidery remains invaluable. Her groundbreaking books, The Subversive Stitch, Embroidery and the Making of the Feminine from 1984, argued that far from an innocent or frivolous hobby, decorative needlework has since medieval times carried multifaceted cultural significance regarding the division of labor, the formation of domesticity, and the disciplining of unruly women. Not only that, Parker sees the relationship between stitching and femininity as knotted and reciprocal, claiming that in many regards, the category of woman was bound up in economic transformations around the organization of the household, and in which embroidery played a central rather than peripheral role. In Parker's account, embroidery emerges as double-edged, both a mechanism of control for women's energies, but also a place for them to express their frustrations and desires, and to even foment a radical politics of resistance. Parker's important work talks about the inculcation of femininity within the so-called private sphere, but this doesn't account for a racialized house servant like Reinbold, who did not have the luxury of a division between public and private, for she lived where she worked, with a constant monitoring of her activities by her employers at all times. Starting in the late 60s and continuing today, many self-identified feminist and queer artists have reclaimed textile making from its marginalized status as minor decor. And this movement began in just the moment that Santos Reinbold herself turned to embroidery, though likely for very different reasons. And I can only gesture to some of the many figures from around the world whose work provides a rich set of comparisons for Santos Reinbold, including the large-scale embroideries of the Chilean musician and activist Violeta Parra, the queer stitches of the Brazilian Leo Nilsson, the trapuntos of Philippine-born Pasita Abad, and the tangled textures of the contemporary artist, the Brazilian Rosana Paulino. Some of these figures were active when Santos Reinbold was also making her embroideries, while others have emerged more recently. But all turn to the tactility of thread in their work and to fiber's unique ability to conjure bodies through its insistence on hand working. In addition to these practices, textile handmaking across the 20th century has been mobilized by everyday crafters who don't necessarily consider themselves artists to pay political witness, particularly in circumstances of collective trauma like war, forced migration, and dispossession. Examples of embroidery as a relatively affordable and accessible form of testimony proliferate from an array of cultures, including the burlap-backed appliques called arpilleras, sewn in Chile during the brutalities of the Augusto Pinochet dictatorship, Hmong story cloths that serve as accounts for Laotian refugees in the aftermath of the US war of aggression in Southeast Asia, and South African embroideries made by Black women in the wake of apartheid. In these situations, stitching is recruited not only because its materials are expedient, but because its tactile qualities and its ability, but also because of its ability to tell otherwise neglected stories. Embroidery thus functions as an embodied alternative archive from below that can counter official dominant narratives. With its many small motions and repetitions, needlework has been seen as soothing or calming, but the primary activity of the stitch is one of piercing through. The multiple punctures of embroidery can also be cathartic, angry, dissident, and resistant. And the accrual of these marks have the potential to signify both as pacifying and also as violent. What is more, when you embellish a fabric, far from a kind of like frivolous ornamentation, you actually are reinforcing it. You make the fabric literally stronger when you embroider. So within this welter of textile activities from diverse locations, I want to insist upon the important affinities that exist between Santos Reinbold and other African diasporic female makers. I believe we can look to their needlework as a model for how we might augment or embellish art histories. And I mean this to embellish art history, not in the sense of it as kind of like a fictional fantasy, as when someone embroiders a story and that means they're basically making things up. But to embellish a story is to give it more frills, to make it more dazzling. And it's a way, I think, of extending our purview of what is proper to art history, again, even in the face of a kind of lack of an archive. Santos-Reinboldt's consistent return to scenes of the natural world and the intimacies of Black community life have been productively placed next to the painter, Maria Auxiliadora, who is another Brazilian woman who left the fertile creative circle of her family for employment as a housekeeper, one of the few paths available of steady payment for Black women in Brazil in the 20th century. Both had extensive matrilineal training with textiles, and in these paintings, clothing is especially keenly observed. Because I recognize the important pedagogical role played by mothers, grandmothers, and aunts in transmitting needlework techniques, I reject the term self-taught when discussing these women, for the term erases the profoundly gendered collective teachings passed down within households. These women did not in any way teach themselves, but were part of larger multi-generational networks of highly skilled training and learning. And this has already been mentioned in the conversation earlier between Bill and Lynn Cook. Other fertile connections can be posited between Santos-Reinboldt and US Black artists, including the quilt maker and mother-taught artist Rosie Lee Tompkins. And I use that word mother-taught, that's my term, but I do prefer the term uncredentialed, which is a term that I learned from Lynn Cook. And Rosie Lee Tompkins' quilts did not originally circulate within the fine art world and have a very complicated relationship to that world. Her vibrantly pieced quilts echo the abstractions of Santos-Reinboldt, and with their nested squares and optical flickering, they call to mind textile traditions from West Africa and serve as a reminder that abstraction was as rooted in decorative functional fabric patterns as it was translated onto canvas by white male modern artists. In terms of more figurative work, Santos-Reinboldt can also be placed next to the Black feminist artist Faith Ringgold, who in 1980 began making story quilts with her mother. Ringgold, like Santos-Reinboldt, portrayed scenes of Black life that include depictions of religious gatherings, such as works like Church Picnic Story Quilt from 1988, made from printed fabrics and acrylic paint on cotton canvas. Ringgold's piece shows Black children, men, and women in their Sunday finest as they feast on an array of dishes that are spread on blankets and frolic in the green grass. In the text, Ringgold spells out how this intergenerational party was hosted by the Freedom Baptist Church in Atlanta in 1909. She revisits this history as a way to emphasize an African-American past full of Black thriving and care. The artist, who is also mother-taught and learned to sew from her mother, who was a fashion designer and seamstress in Harlem, pays special attention to her character's self-fashioning, lavishing details on the women's hats, the men's ties, and the children in their trousers and knee socks. In the case of Santos-Reinboldt's work, though they sometimes include quite ordinary and recognizable elements, cows, trees, women in dresses, chickens, flowers, churches, due to their textured compositions and the intense multi-directionality of her embroidered lines, which zig and zag with an unusual liveliness, they can take on otherworldly qualities. Foreground and background sometimes melt into each other, and this is not just a matter of Santos-Reinboldt's use of scale and her disregard for conventions of perspective, in which most objects take on equivalent size and are of equal importance across the picture plane. She typically covered every available part of the backing with a swarm of stitches. There's rarely any spots without something of visual interest, and her bold use of coloration guides viewers' eyes restlessly around her surfaces. And here I want to acknowledge that the very first solo show ever of Madalena Santos-Reinboldt is currently on view at MOSB, curated with a lot of love by my brilliant colleagues, Amanda and Andre. I just saw the installation there a few weeks ago in Sao Paulo, and it was really a revelation. There is also a catalog, and I have a contribution in this book, and I want to extend my congratulations to them for this wonderful and very important exhibition. As these Black women like Ringgold and Tompkins and Auxiliadora and Santos-Reinboldt utilize and depict threads, they do so knowing how entwined their own histories are with the violence of the textile trade and its reliance on slavery. Rosie Lee Tompkins and Santos-Reinboldt both grew up picking cotton, Maria Auxiliadora painted pictures of harvesting cotton, and some of Ringgold's earliest works with textiles were her slave rape series. Attempting to describe the slave trade and its lashing together of Africa and the Americas, Afro-Caribbean theorist Edward Glissant writes, and I've shown you this remarkable clip here that's actually from a footnote. The slave trade came through the cramped doorway of the slave ship, leaving a wake like that of crawling desert caravans. It might be drawn like this. African countries to the east, the lands of America to the west. This creature is in the image of a fibril. Glissant conceptualizes the interconnectivity between Africa and the Americas as a textile fiber, and he includes this hand-drawn rendering of precisely this thread. Some of the relationships depicted in Santos Reinbold's embroideries remain mysterious to me as a viewer, and I take this to be an intentional choice on her part, one that is in part driven by her material choice, but also by an aesthetic and possibly political decision to render some boundaries as porous. It's not always easy to distinguish if a stitched line is demarcating an outline of a figure or is suggesting an energetic aura or spirit. Some of her work imparts the sense that humans are blurring into the atmosphere, or that the sky is dissolving into a mountain, or that a creature is unraveling into an adjacent creature. Hers is not a universe of precise details or mappable specifics. Instead, she conjures moods, the hectic abundance of ranch life teeming with cattle and sheep, the rhythmic excitement of a parade, the night blazing with stars. It is a recognition of the aliveness of land, and the feeling is of constant, pulsing, unexpected growth as trees spurt upwards towards the sun and things swirl together in perpetual motion. Unlike the crisply personalized renderings of people and recognizable portraits sometimes found in Ringgold's work, Santos Reinbold is less interested in individual features and depicts faces as schematic and simplified, though her use of black, white, pink, and brown threads for bodies and faces means they are usually recognizably racialized. And these landscapes are not mere bucolic portrayals of an idealized childhood. Instead, she acknowledges racial difference, and her jagged bodies and sometimes dissonant chromatic choices suggest a world of constraints and tensions. She's fascinated by the dynamics of crowds whose movements are rendered via their off-kilter torsos and wavy lines, or the interplay between humans, assortments of animals, and the landscape. Another model for Santos Reinbold's impenetrability is found in Glissant, who wrote influentially about opacity, the right of minoritized subjects to remain outside regimes of surveillance and power structures of nobility as a key strategy for Black survival. In his Poetics of Relation, Glissant recruits another textile metaphor, writing that, quote, opacities can coexist and converge, weaving fabrics. To understand these, one must truly focus on the texture of the weave and not on the nature of its components. For the time being, perhaps, give up this old obsession with discovering what lies at the bottom of natures. Though Santos Reinbold generated recognizable iconography grounded in her Bahia childhood, her distinctive, tightly compacted style of embroidery scrambles her scenes, jumbling subjects with stitches that sometimes refuse to cohere into full legibility. Her webs of threads suggest productive opacities that refuse the viewer access to all of her scenes, and instead allow us to linger on her textures. And so to conclude, Santos Reinbold's practice with needle and thread proposed that stitching might be a powerful procedure that can suture new histories together and rewrite forcibly occluded narratives. This returns me to the idea of embellished or embroidered stories, and note that these are near synonyms, the embellishment or the embroider, to embellish or to embroider. It takes us into the question of the hypothetical. And here I conjecture that embroidery is not just an unnecessary decorative surplus or supplement, but can also be a means of taking up space, of extending oneself further into the world, and of strengthening a foundation. And I'm thinking further of how the word fabrication, which also can mean kind of making something up, comes from the root word of fabric. This also brings me to the notion of embroidering narratives as a way of productively speculating, given a lack of archival evidence. In this embellished sphere, Santos Reinboldt's embroideries, many of which were lost, and about which we must now conjecture, might lead us to expanded art histories. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, so. Let's see. It says I'm sharing, but I don't see it. Can everyone see that?
No, we don't see anything. It's oh, now we see it.
You see it?
Yes, you have to play it.
Right. Okay.
Put a slideshow and then play from start.
Right. Is that good?
Yeah, good.
Okay, great. Yeah, I have a very short 4 to 5 minute synthetic discussion. Thank you so much for these really revelatory papers. There's so much more to say, and I want to keep this short so that we have a little bit of time for discussion. So let me try and sort of draw some connections among these papers. Each of these 3 case studies locates their subjects within a very rich cultural environment, wherein the material production of paintings and embroideries is shaped by collective memory, by labor, by artisanal work, and by handwork, by communal knowledge that is passed across generations or generated by migratory movements across space. Their work is deeply situated within the, to use Julia's word, within the entanglements of work, of everyday life, and creative engagement that have structured centuries of human production. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. Madalena Santos Reinboldt, which is the focus of Julia's paper, she offers such a body of work of such depth and complexity that is also rooted in visual traditions and in the long histories of women crafting things. Her embroidery, as Julia argues, has been rendered largely invisible by the category of art itself. And the ways in which that's imbricated in gendered and classed and raced hierarchies of value that demote craft traditions and craft practices as women's work. Julia suggests that we jettison the label of art altogether. But what happens if, instead of weighing down the idea of art with originating male aesthetic theories of transcendence and freedom from the entanglements of work and necessity, all those ideas that are wrapped up in the notion of the aesthetic from the 18th century forward, what if we let go of those and understand art instead as an expression of work? And that is, I think, one of the lessons indeed of Hirshfield's wonderful visual universe. In the case of Hirshfield himself, the imprint of work traditions is there very much, as Richard has discussed, in the process of designing and cutting patterns and the way they fit together into sort of jigsaw-like form. Hirshfield's apparent dread of empty surfaces or spaces seems to come directly out of his career as a tailor and a slipper designer. His endlessly generative visual imagination, confronted with a white canvas and unencumbered by learned compositional forms, and I would qualify that a little bit because he was, as we've heard, he was very literate in many areas. But this visual imagination sort of goes into overdrive. He's not encumbered by those earlier precedents. Santos Reinboldt and John Dunkley also hold these kind of space-filling energies in common with Hirshfield. So that's something that I think extends across these figures. And yet the aesthetic power of the decorative still has to be periodically reasserted in the face of Clement Greenberg's now famous dismissive comment that decoration is the specter that haunts modern painting. Reinboldt and Hirshfield also both disrupt, as Julie's just talked about so beautifully, the way into which they're all disrupting these figure ground hierarchies. and with their visual insistence on kind of overall patterning, and the ways in which the figures are integrated into a landscape that is as animated and as intensely alive as the figures are. In rethinking art as work, then, we might consider the ways in which the forms of fabrication themselves, for Santos Reinbold, the piercing punctures of the needle pushing through fabric, the ways in which those carry meaning, the materials of needle and thread and fabric, creating embroideries in which process and substance, method and meaning are so intertwined. In which making objects of power and beauty carries this kind of cathartic form of resistance to the barriers of a classed and raced and gendered world. And we see how work and process imprint themselves on the world of materials, and how art and artisanal work are closely linked in their transformational power. And I want to just flash on this image of a work I saw, and which started this process of thinking about this kind of art as work, which is this very poignant, I find it very poignant work at the Museum of Modern Art in the Alfred Barr Galleries by James Castle, in which he painstakingly reconstructs a chair in 2 dimensions, elevating this purely utilitarian object into something that is blessed and transformed by the spirit of work and the work that he did in the world. Work also emerges again in the subtext of John Dunkley's Going to Market in Nicole Smythe-John's paper. Instead of borrowing a familiar colonialist trope whose function was to render Jamaica aesthetically and economically available, Dunkley's Man with a Donkey is enfolded in a symbolic landscape that references his own migratory travels as a sailor, travels that generate, as Nicole has shown, has argued, a post-colonial Pan-African consciousness of his place within an expanded hemispheric world. On the nowhere edge of imperial powers, Jamaica emerges in her telling into a far more central position within global development, sustained by a migratory workforce of men like Dunkley himself, who collectively forge a new transnational and potentially revolutionary consciousness and identity. And this geography of work is hemispheric rather than national. It tracks a network within which the US is actually decentered in its role as global hegemon. Here we have an artist marginalized once again by race and class, but who reclaims a landscape decolonized by the force of his imagination. Movement, physical movement, political, and also cultural movement often happens from the margins, as we learn from these wonderful papers. So just very briefly, to bring in Rodrigo Moura's Brazilian masters of the vernacular world of everyday workers. These are 3 images that Rodrigo didn't talk about, but they were part of that popular painters and visionary artists exhibition at the Museo del Barrio. These are, as I think what I partly learned from Rodrigo's presentation, is this idea that they're really asserting their presence within a landscape, Brazilian cultural landscape, that had been defined up until that point by conventional elitist canons of high art, Eurocentric canons of high art, and the ways in which many of these artists who are part of a Brazilian labor movement and deeply implicated in work, especially even Genera, who's painting mining scenes and labor, the industries of mining, the most gruesome kind of difficult kind of labor, but the ways in which that imbrication in this culture of work and industrial labor in some cases also gives them a kind of claim to an indigenous ownership of culture at a time when Brazil in the 1930s forward is just starting to shift away from its Eurocentric fixations towards a more indigenous understanding of culture. So in these 3 bodies of work, we glimpse the transformative potential of art work that exists on the margins, the power to paint the garbage can and the world in different colors, to create new geographies and a new transnational politics of identity that is shaped by migratory labor, and to call for recognition by the nationalizing institutions of art as these were beginning to grapple with the heritage of Eurocentric canons of modernism. So I'll end there and thank you once again, and open this up to questions. I'll start by, let's see, I'm going to stop sharing and start by asking the three paper givers if you have questions for one another or anything that you'd like to follow up on. And then if there are questions from the audience, we can go. I have my own questions, but I'll defer to you.
Well, thank you, Angela. Can I just jump in and just express my gratitude to Angela for that really thoughtful conjuration of some of the points of intersections between these fascinating panels, and to offer my thanks to Nicole and Rodrigo again for sharing your thoughts. I'm really glad that the three of us were able to have a more hemispheric approach to this contested word, American, and I'm really grateful to the organizers of the conference for not having it all be so US focused. So. Yeah. And thank you, Angela, for drawing out the thematic of labor, which was really important amongst the three of us. And I would just say that I just noticing over the course of the day, there was only really one other, besides Magdalena Santos-Reinbold, there was only one other woman that was focused on today, and that was in Brooke Wyatt's presentation about S. Louis, which was fantastic. And rather than downplay the fact that both of these artists were housekeepers, I actually want to amplify the fact that they were both housekeepers, because I think that that employment completely structures their material horizons of possibility and and the conditions in which they were working. So yeah.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd like just to share a little bit. Also, thank you so much, Angela, for this really beautiful continuation of everybody's presentation. And I think it's really wonderful to brought up about labor and and different forms of work, but there's something that I can't stop thinking about. Also, the term self-taught appears in the comment box here. Someone say it's time to put the term self-taught gently in its grave next to primitive, naive, and outsider. But you made a great point, Julia, when you said how you refuse the term self-taught in terms of these artists because they have their own training. Also, that's such a biased categorization, because I mean, I'm thinking about an artist that was not part of my presentation, Amadeo Lorenzato, who worked in civil construction for decades and whose work is completely informed by that knowledge. And I think, there's, different trades inform different practices, and that's an important notion to I think, develop as we look at the work of these artists. But I think in terms of, my presentation and Nicole's and yours, I think there's always this really strong tension between free labor and enslaved labor in the Americas. Now that really informs how the institutions frame these artists over time, and how the artists really push the institutions in several ways. So I did have a question for you, Julia. Did you know much about Madalena showing her work during her lifetime? Because as everybody in Brazil, I learned about her reading about Lota and Bishop, and the passage of the letter that you shared is just like so upsetting and so disturbing, and to your point of how there's no downtime to that labor. But I was just curious, because the book you shared, the Funacci book, is also slightly after her passing. I was just curious about her showing her work during her lifetime.
During her lifetime, sorry, can you hear me? During her, so just to elaborate a little bit more on what we do know about her, which is very little, we have these accounts, very racist and condescending accounts in the letters by Elizabeth Bishop, which are obviously biased in all kinds of ways. And then Santos-Reinbold granted a series of interviews to an anthropologist. So there are also some interviews in her lifetime with an anthropologist who was interested in the question of kind of folkloric art in Brazil. And that anthropologist, and Santos-Reinbold did sell her embroideries to kind of the friends of her employers. But and then she was included in the Brazilian pavilion of the 1978 Venice Biennial because the anthropologist who did those interviews was a kind of advisor. But in terms of showing in her lifetime, not that I know of. Yeah. And the way I even encountered her was because she had a couple of pieces in the Afro-Brazil Museum. Rodrigo, I'm sure you know those pieces that are fascinating. I mean, they're so interesting. And then MAS, where I work, also had a few pieces, and I was going to, my co-curator, Olivia Ardui, and I were going to put her in our show about histories of dance because there are these festival scenes. Maybe they're dancing, and at the end of the day, we just really couldn't tell if they were dancing or walking or maybe just hanging out and swaying. I mean, so that question of the opacity, which I actually, like I said, I take that as a choice. That I take that as an intentional choice on the part of this artist to not have everything be so readable. And in part, I connect that in part to her work conditions, where everything was being surveyed and scrutinized, and she's reserving something for herself, which is her imagination. Anyway, so yeah, there's the current show does have like the bibliography as far as we know it, and it's all, there's nothing in English yet ever, except for this book, which has the translated essays, etc. So it's just she's been really, really, this is finally a moment for more attention to come to her.
Yeah, which is fantastic. So Brazilian popular art popular, as you said in the beginning, is such a vast field. I just don't want to forget to mention there's the Bispo do Rosário, wonderful show for those in New York that just opened this week. Another artist working with embroidery and needlework. But I want, just not to keep it too Brazilian, I wanted to see if I could ask Nicole about trans-Caribbean exchanges around that period that she focused her studies on around this artist and in Jamaican art in general. If she could share with us a little bit about commonalities or just, histories that would be common to different countries in the Caribbean.
So thanks for that, Rodrigo. And, thanks to both of you for a really interesting panel, and to you, Angela, for summing up so beautifully. Dunkley is a little bit unusual in terms of the fact that his artwork was saved and he was canonized. He became part of the kind of national canon with the founding of the National Gallery in Jamaica, which was the first public institution dedicated to art in the English-speaking Caribbean, and that only emerges in 1974. Remember that Jamaica is independent in 1962, along with much of the English-speaking Caribbean. So in terms of his life, the kinds of travels he was doing that I'm talking about as this circum-Caribbean migratory route, yes, all throughout the Caribbean, this was happening. There was constant movement between islands, but also between continental America and the islands in all kinds of directions. Later on, New York becomes more important in this and feeds into the Harlem Renaissance, or what's now called the Harlem Renaissance. So in terms of what we know of his life, which it's really interesting to hear Julia talking about her research and doing research where there's not much archive. That's very much the case with Dunkley. We have these artworks, these paintings and a few sculptures, but we have very little information about Dunkley. A 4-page biography written by his wife shortly after his death, when she organizes a memorial exhibition for him, is the most complete biography we have. And I also want to clarify that Dunkley was a barber, and he was believed to work on plantations. So his wife talks about him traveling around as a sailor, but the best information that we have, and a lot of his work actually speaks to working in mass monoculture plantations throughout this circum-Caribbean area. And so people who are familiar with the United Fruit Company and all of those developments will have a kind of an idea of what that might have been like. So yes, he's a man of his time. There are many others who went on similar travels who are similarly sort of undocumented in the historical archive. Yeah, and like I said, Marcus Garvey is one of those. We have a lot of figures. Malcolm X's mother was of the same generation. So we have a lot of figures that we know of that were doing this same kind of route. But in terms of his artwork actually being preserved and available to look at and think about today, to the extent that Dunkley's work is, that's quite rare. And to Julia's point, I also think a lot about glissant and opacity, because these works are quite difficult to, they sort of fight with you and tease you. A lot of my attempts to work with Dunkley has been like riddled with doubt and having to double back and providing multiple, sometimes readings that don't actually go together. And I think that that is also deliberate on Dunkley's part, because the little that we do know of him, we know that he refused to be part of art classes that were going on at the time, even though he was familiar with these people. He really did not want to be, he brought his painting to the newspaper to be published, but he was not writing editorials. He did not do interviews. And we really hear about him through his wife and that relationship and the significance of her role in sort of maintaining his legacy and his artwork is a big part of my research as well, another kind of care work. So yes, I mean, that's a long-winded answer to your question, Rodrigo, but I hope it's helpful.
That's fascinating, thank you.
Super interesting, because I think the question of the agency of the artist beyond the work is one that always fascinates me. Yeah. I think it's very important when we analyze this material and we study this material.
Yeah, absolutely.
For that.
You're muted. Mathilde, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I wish this conversation could continue. Thank you so much for this fascinating and revelatory end of the day, and thank you all for this expanded vision of modernism and also labor, and also showing us how important and the significance of artists from the global south and artists of color in the study of American art. So that was really a strong end of the day. We are now going to hear from our Jane Kelly, who is going to close the symposium. Jane Collier is president of the Collier Research Institute in New York City. She has written extensively on Anna Mary Robertson Moses, known as Grandma Moses, as well as John Kane and Morris Hirshfield. She created exhibitions for many major museums, including the American Folk Art Museum and the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. So please give a warm welcome to Jane Collier, who will be closing our symposium today. Thank you. And hi, Jane.
Hi. Thank you, Mathilde. Thank you also to all our wonderful speakers for their stimulating presentations, and to everyone at the American Folk Art Museum for organizing this event on the occasion of Richard Meyer's great Hirshfield exhibition. Hold on. I am having a problem screen sharing. Wait a second. Okay, can everybody see that?
That's good.
We're good? Yay. Okay. It's an honor for me to be asked to wrap up today's proceedings. The topics we've been discussing, primitivism, exclusion, and modernism, are key to evaluating the contributions of artists working outside the academic mainstream in 20th century Europe and the Americas. Our speakers covered a lot of ground. To recap, we began by examining some of the self-taught artists promoted by the Museum of Modern Art in the interwar period. And then we took a deep dive into the work of artists who were largely excluded from that foundational paradigm. The Yanktonai Dakota painter Oscar Howe strayed from the formulaic primitivism taught at the Santa Fe Indian School and therefore wasn't accepted as authentic by cultural gatekeepers. Whereas Euro-American modernism developed through transatlantic cultural exchange, the Jamaican artist John Dunkley was shaped by circum-Caribbean migratory patterns that foregrounded the experiences of the subaltern populations that literally built modern America. Rodrigo Moura noted that Latin American artists often melded popular and vernacular influences in a manner that belies conventional high-low dichotomies. And in her discussion of Madalena Santos Reinbold's embroideries, Julia Bryan-Wilson raised the provocative question of whether this work, with its multivalent ties to African diasporic traditions, Brazilian folklore, and the broader gendered history of needlework, should even be considered art, given the white upper-class masculinist origins of that concept. Terminology has always been a problem in this field. In my closing remarks, I'll use the generally accepted, though flawed, descriptor self-taught when referring to these artists in general, and primitive when discussing the time period during which that term was most prevalent. My own area of specialization is what, in the context of this symposium, we might think of as the MoMA primitives, the generation of self-taught painters who came to the attention of the art establishment in the 1930s and 40s. In 1940, my grandfather, Otto Kallier, gave Anna Mary Robertson Moses her first solo show at the Gallery Saint-Étienne, of which I became co-director in 1979. I've always believed that self-taught artists deserve the same degree of respect and careful study as their schooled colleagues. To that end, I tracked down Moses's source materials and drawings, which she'd been told to keep secret, and wrote an in-depth study of her methods and development. I also salvaged John Kane's drawings, which his children had been instructed to destroy. And I developed a close working relationship with Morris Hirshfield's grandson, Robert Renser, who had preserved a number of the artist's full-scale preliminary drawings. My talk is going to focus on these three artists, Moses, Kane, and Hirshfield, as well as Henri Rousseau, whom Alfred Barr and others considered the quote-unquote archetypal primitive. Primitivism is central to modernism's origin story. As colonization moved over the course of the 19th century, from conquest and plunder to the trickier tasks of governance and trade, cross-cultural communication increased. At the same time, industrialization was gradually upending the hereditary European aristocracy, creating a new, more capitalistically oriented Western elite. European modernism started off as a wholehearted rebuke to the bourgeois culture engendered by industrial capitalism. For the most part, the artists who emerged in the late 19th century were themselves members of and supported by the bourgeoisie, but they wanted to invent a new art, free from what they perceived as the pernicious influence of Western civilization. The desire to restore humans to a quote-unquote pure state of nature and the concomitant idealization of the so-called noble savage was deeply ingrained in the European mindset, dating back to the 18th century Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. That's why the modernists' initial valorization of primitivism was indiscriminate, throwing together African and oceanic sculpture, folk art, children's finger painting, work by patients in psychiatric hospitals, etc., etc. Drawing in part on the newly accessible art of non-Western peoples, this catch-all category also included domestic work by those who, often for socioeconomic reasons, had been denied formal schooling in art. Channeled through Jean Dubuffet, the need to separate so-called raw art from that which had been overcooked by civilization persisted into the late 20th century, even as some of the earlier categories of primitive art, such as folk and tribal work, were siphoned off into separate fields of study. Many of today's speakers stressed the relationship between self-taught artists and the early 20th century avant-garde, but I question whether the art establishment was ever really prepared to accept these artists on an equal footing. In the words of Alfred Barr, Henri Rousseau was distinguished by his, quote, psychological and pictorial innocence, his naive realism and fantasy, and his independence of tradition, end quote. The checklist of qualities required for inclusion in this new category of art was expanded upon by Sidney Janis in They Taught Themselves. Isolated from one another and from the art world, these artists supposedly remained untouched by any quote unquote developed painting culture, and unlike their trained colleagues or children who eventually grow up, it was believed that they seldom developed. Their style, Janis observed, quote, most frequently comes to fruition with the first picture, end quote. As Richard Meyer mentions in his Hirshfield monograph, Janis made a point of identifying self-taught artists according to their non-artistic former professions. Cloak and suit manufacturer in the case of Hirshfield, house painter for John Kane, and so on. This sort of biographical qualifying became even more pronounced with the advent of art brut, which required of its creators such a profound remove from quote unquote received culture that it effectively admitted only extremely marginalized individuals. From the very beginning, biography tended to eclipse art when it came to discussing self-taught painters. Rousseau wasn't, in fact, a douanier, that is, a customs inspector, but rather worked for the Paris Municipal Toll Service. However, for years, he was referred to neither as a painter, nor even by his own name, but merely as le douanier. The emphasis on biography no doubt had human interest appeal. When Kane was admitted to the Carnegie International in 1927, the first American self-taught artist ever to win such recognition, the press flocked to see him in the Pittsburgh slum where he lived. Kane, who'd lost a leg years earlier in a railroad accident, regaled reporters with tales of his days as a quote-unquote brawny man, who not only helped build the city's bridges and roads, but could hold his own in the boxing ring. The most noteworthy human interest story was probably that of Anna Mary Robertson Moses, commonly referred to as Grandma Moses. Identified as a housewife in They Taught Themselves and a farm wife in the title of her first solo show, Moses later authored a best-selling autobiography and became a darling of the post-war media. Still, beneath such evident success stories, it's often possible to detect an undercurrent of hostility. The more famous Grandma Moses became, the more she was disowned by the art world establishment. Kane was attacked by the trained painters who'd failed to win favor with the Carnegie's jury, and a Pittsburgh newspaper tried to expose him as a fraud. Even as Rousseau gained the support of the nascent French avant-garde, he remained a laughingstock at the Salon des Indépendants, where crowds greeted his annual appearances as an entertaining sideshow. Foreshadowing the later criticisms of Hirshfield's renderings of feet, one journalist rebuked Rousseau for painting hands without thumbs. As in Pittsburgh, so too in New York, American artists were furious that the Museum of Modern Art was largely ignoring them. In the first decade of its existence, the museum's view of modernism was decidedly Eurocentric. Barr thought modern primitives could be used to introduce US audiences to the broader tenets of modernism because the primitives were both more quote unquote international in character than their schooled American colleagues, and more democratic in that they, quote, all express the straightforward, innocent, and convincing vision of the common man, end quote. As we now know, MoMA's early dalliance with self-taught artists came to an abrupt end with the 1943 Hirshfield show. Last year, it was stories about the talking horse, sneered critic Peyton Boswell. This year, it's Morris Hirshfield. Defined by their folksy biographies and purported naivete, Hirshfield and his self-taught peers had arguably been typecast as fools. Wilhelm Ude, whom we met this morning in connection with Séraphine Louis, stressed the artless simplicity of his self-styled Sacred Heart group. Ude's 1911 Rousseau monograph is full of anecdotes illustrating the painter's gullibility and ignorance. It was often noted that Rousseau admired all the wrong artists, Adolphe Bouguereau, Jean-Léon Gérôme, and other stale academics whom the avant-garde loathed. Hirshfield, according to Janice, also had unacceptably retrograde taste in art. Janice further intimated that self-taught artists didn't necessarily know what they were doing. Quote, a great disparity exists between what they believe and what they have actually accomplished, he wrote. Although convinced that they have made a photographic reproduction of the world of reality, they have actually transmuted it to a new pictorial reality, end quote. Self-taught artists were, in effect, accidental modernists. And it's apparent that these early 20th century self-taught painters didn't particularly like modern art. Rousseau thought Cézanne couldn't draw and that Matisse's work was, quote unquote, horribly ugly. As Richard mentioned in his introductory remarks, Hirshfield was appalled to learn that Mondrian's famous painting, Broadway Boogie Woogie, had been acquired by the Museum of Modern Art. They paid money for that, he exclaimed. Moses was somewhat more polite. Asked what she thought of abstract art, she opined that it might be, quote, good for a rug or a piece of linoleum. The fact that there's a resemblance between the work of modern primitives and the mainstream modernists doesn't mean there was a deeper connection between the two. To some extent, primitives were selected based on unintentional visual similarities, and trained painters weren't above appropriating those innovations. As the philosopher and critic Arthur C. Danto noted, quote, "There is no greater illusion in art than the view that the similarity of objects entails a similarity of vision," end quote. Danto codified the concept of the art world as a commingling of artists, curators, art historians, dealers, collectors, and critics who collectively determine what constitutes art. These cognoscenti created institutional structures that became every bit as entrenched as the 19th century academies against which the early modernists rebelled. Schooled artists were part of the art world, but self-taught artists, by definition, weren't. They were seldom permitted to shape the discourse surrounding their own work, but as mentioned earlier, often had mediators who spoke for them. As Lynn Cook noted, it can be difficult to recover the voices of early 20th century self-taught artists because the myth of naivete occluded their creative processes and intentions. The excavation of these artists' actual histories began with Rousseau and continued with monographic studies of Moses, Horace Pippin, Cain, and last but not least, Richard's pioneering work on Hirshfield. These studies show that, contrary to earlier preconceptions, most self-taught artists weren't uninfluenced, and their styles usually did evolve over time. Many of them learned just the way their trained colleagues do, by copying. Popular prints and illustrations were the most common influences. Although these source images were often highly detailed, artists like Rousseau and Moses traced only the outlines, resulting in a flatness that is more stereotypically modern. It's been theorized that Rousseau may have inspired the Cubists' so-called invention of collage in 1912. Similarly, Janis points out parallels between Hirshfield's quote-unquote unconscious incorporation of pre-existing imagery in his first paintings, Beach Girl and Angora Cat, and the use of collage by Salvador Dali and Max Ernst. In fact, however, the use of printed sources by self-taught artists dates back to the days when such images were first disseminated, but only when these stratagems migrated into the work of mainstream modernists was the transmutation of printed materials heralded as a major innovation. In the hands of self-taught artists, copying was long considered a shameful defect. Rousseau was ridiculed for describing himself as, quote unquote, one of our best realist painters, and for suggesting that he could, quote unquote, finish Cézanne's work. However, Rousseau made quick oil sketches that were, in many respects, as sophisticated as the work of the Impressionists. By finishing his compositions, he imparted a precision that genuinely was more realistic. We see this sort of every leaf realism also in the work of Hirshfield, whose appreciation of decorative detail was honed during his years as a clothing designer. Rather than belittling self-taught artists for their supposedly naive conceptions of reality, it might be wise to take them at their word. Photography and post-Renaissance Western painting do not, after all, offer the only correct readings of reality. Single-point perspective demands an either-or choice between foreground and background, dictating that distant objects be rendered less distinctly. But why should a picture not include everything the artist knows to be there, rather than just what can be seen for a particular vantage point? Finding conventional perspective too constraining, Moses and Cain both combined multiple views in their landscapes. Positioning the primitive as what Barr called, quote, a tributary of one of the mainstreams of modern taste, end quote, does little to help us understand these artists on their own terms. His famous chart, which we've seen several times today, leaves Rousseau on the sidelines. Unlike mainstream modernists, self-taught artists lack any overarching stylistic or intellectual cohesion. They constitute an all-purpose other, a genre that exists as such only in juxtaposition to mainstream modernism. Today's speakers have demonstrated that the boundaries between the primitive and the modern were often porous. But does that mean that the two are really one and the same? How widely can the definition of modernism be stretched and still retain any significance? How useful are those subordinate isms which were constructed to bolster a white Eurocentric cultural model? What would a more inclusive alternative paradigm look like? What, if any, would be the selection criteria? Are all artworks equally important, equally engaging, equally rewarding of repeat viewing? And what about quality, which lately has become a vexed concept? I leave you with those questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane, for this wonderful talk and closing this program with so many great questions. It gives us a lot to think and reflect on. As this symposium is coming to an end, I would like to thank Richard Meyer, whose research was a real inspiration and a starting point for this symposium. I also want to thank all our speakers for joining us today and sharing their generous and insights, perspectives. It was an absolute honor and privilege to have such an esteemed panel to lead us through the complexities of modernism and expose the unique position of self-taught art or uncredentialed artists in this history. We are grateful for your engagement and scholarship, which is really truly in line with the mission of the museum, which is, as you know, always elevate the work of artists working outside the academic mainstream. So I would also like to thank our SL interpreters, Brenna Stakler and Sherry Brown, who were with us all day. And so I would like to acknowledge their labor today. Also, everyone who joined today and for your great questions. I hope you enjoyed the program and this deep study of the interwar period, and that will inspire you to come to the museum and see this wonderful, fantastic exhibition, which is on view until Sunday. So you have only 2 days to see it. We continue to offer both virtual and in-person programs. So please visit the website of the museum and to see what's coming next. And I would like to thank again everyone and see you next time. Thank you.